So the space around the brain and the spinal cord that the cerebrospinal fluid is circulating around is called subarachnoid space. So the way it works is that cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the ventricles, of the brain. First, it's produced in the lateral ventricles. They fill up, then the cerebrospinal fluid moves into the third ventricle. More cerebrospinal fluid is added in the third ventricle. Then the cerebrospinal fluid drips into the fourth ventricle, where more cerebrospinal fluid is produced, and then it starts to come through to the spinal cord through the central canal, also to the subarachnoid space through the lateral aperture and median aperture. The way cerebrospinal fluid is produced in ventricles is through the structures called choroid plexuses. Choroid plexuses are located in the walls of the ventricles. So, for example, this is the lateral ventricle, and this is in red shown the position of the choroid plexus inside of the ventricle. So, ventricle itself is a space that is lined with special membrane, but also this reddish tissue called choroid plexus. And what it is, it's a network of the blood vessels that we will discuss shortly. This is the third ventricle. It's got choroid plexus in its upper wall, and then this is the fourth ventricle. It's got choroid plexus in its posterior wall. Okay. To review the cerebrospinal fluid production, cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the ventricles, in the two lateral ventricles, the right and the left ventricle, then in the third ventricle, connected by the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricles. Then we have fourth ventricle connected to the central canal of the spinal cord and the subarachnoid space around the brain and the spinal cord. The dural venous sinuses also participate in the cerebrospinal fluid homeostasis. They have special structures in them called arachnoid villi, and dural venous sinuses is how cerebrospinal fluid is returned back into the blood. So actually, the cerebrospinal fluid is made from the blood plasma by the choroid plexuses, then it circulates around the brain and the spinal cord and is returned to the blood by the dural venous sinuses through the arachnoid villi. So I'll show you some pictures of how that is done before we will review the dural venous sinuses. The dural venous sinuses are special kind of like blood vessels around the brain that highlighted here in blue that return the deoxygenated blood, the blood that is deprived of oxygen. It's also the blood deprived of nutrients because brain cells took up those chemicals, and this is the blood that also contains the waste products that the brain produces. So the blood needs to be returned to the systemic circulation for cleaning and oxygenation. And the dural venous sinuses, we see them along the brain midline. Okay, here. There's also dural venous sinuses between the lobes of the cerebrum, between the frontal and the temporal lobe. Then there's dural venous sinus connecting this sinus right here with the top one. This is between the parietal and occipital lobe. And then here's another dural venous sinus. And eventually they all collect all the blood around the brain, even from the smallest blood vessels, and return it into the jugular vein. So here's some labels of what these main sinuses are. So the top sinus that follows the midline along the longitudinal fissure of the hemispheres of the brain. This is called the superior sagittal sinus. The sinus that all of these blood vessels and superior sagittal sinus merge into between the cerebrum and cerebellum is called transverse sinus. I try to move it a little bit in so you can see at least some of the names. And then transverse sinus curves down like this. It's a transverse sinus, then it goes down, across, down. This is called sigmoid sinus. Sigmoid sinus is the transverse sinus becoming the vertical vein called the internal jugular vein that is located in the neck. And I have a picture of the internal jugular neck. So this is the neck blood vessels to orient you. So this is the neck right here. This is the Adam's apple, the voice box. So kind of like the middle of the neck. Here we have the collarbones This one is cut to show what's under the collarbone. There's neck muscles, the sternocleidomastoid muscle connected to the clavicle right here. This is the trachea, thyroid gland. So this is the windpipe that is located in the front of our neck. It is overlapped by the muscles, and under the muscle there's going to be blood vessels. These blood vessels are red and blue. The red blood vessels are arteries that bring blood to the brain that is fresh and oxygenated, has lots of nutrients, it has oxygen. And the blue blood vessels return blood back from the brain, and this blood vessel is called the internal jugular vein. We have two of those on the right side and the left side. We can see it better here because the muscles and the bones cut away, but it actually passes under the sternocleidomastoid muscle and the collarbone. So this would be the jugular vein on the right side. This is the jugular vein on the left side, and they return blood all the way to the heart for the systemic circulation. The blood vessels that bring blood to the brain, the red ones, they follow the same trajectory as the blue blood vessels. They are more medial to the veins. These are arteries, and they're called the common carotid arteries. They run next to the jugular veins, and they bring blood in this direction towards the brain. This is the left common carotid artery. This is the right common carotid artery, and this is the left jugular vein, and this is the right jugular vein. So to review this in a picture from your textbook, this is a little different view. The view here is lateral, and we only see the right side of the face of the blood vessels. And here we have the thickest vein, the internal jugular vein, exiting the skull, where it was collecting blood from the sinuses, the superior sagittal sinus. There's also straight sinus. There's transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus. And then becoming, as it exits, becoming the jugular vein, the internal jugular vein, because it comes from the inside. That's why it's called internal. There's also external jugular vein, more lateral to the internal jugular vein. And external jugular vein is the vein that drains blood from the outside of the skull. So you can see the blood vessels are on the outside of the skull. They are the blood, that's the blood that comes from the face structures, from the muscle of the face, the skin of the face, and it's a little bit smaller, and it also returns blood to the heart. So that's a little different. There's an additional vein that aids the internal jugular vein in draining the blood from the brain. So from the transverse sinus, there is a smaller vein that's going to become, there's a smaller sinus that is called occipital sinus. Occipital sinus will become the smaller vein that also returns blood back to the heart, and this is called vertebral vein. So it's draining blood from the occipital region of the brain and also cerebellum. Okay, and of course the vertebral vein and internal jugular vein will be located on the right side and the left side. So there's right and left internal jugular veins and right and left vertebral jugular veins, as well as right and left external jugular veins. Okay, so let's talk about how the cerebrospinal fluid becomes that venous blood. It becomes the venous blood through the structures called arachnoid villi. And to orient you in this picture right here in blue, we're looking at the dural venous sinus, and it's filled with venous blood with blue. It's a space between the dura mater of the brain, the meninges of the brain that cover the brain. The meninges of the brain are located under the cranial bone. So this is the cranial bone. This is the dura mater, the meninges. It's got two layers. One layer, the more superficial layer, it follows the bone shape on the inside, and the second layer, the more deep layer, it follows the surface of the brain, and the brain could also have deep crevices. This is the longitudinal fissure between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum, so the dura mater will follow the surface of each of these hemispheres, and as a result there's going to be a little space that forms between these dura mater parts, and this space is filled with venous blood that will be collecting from around the brain. In addition to venous blood that collects from around the brain into these dural venous sinuses, the cerebrospinal fluid will also be collecting into that space. So I'll shift a little bit. Okay, so under the dura mater, we have a layer that is called arachnoid mater. This is arachnoid mater. And under the arachnoid mater, there's going to be a space. And then there's going to be the last final layer of meninges is the pia mater, the very thin one that has blood vessels in it. So the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, they are definitely thinner than the dura mater. Dura mater is the thickest, arachnoid mater is much thinner, and pia mater is very, very thin. So between arachnoid mater and pia mater, there is a space, and that space is filled with CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid. This is called the subarachnoid space. So subarachnoid space is filled with CSF. In addition, arachnoid villi are formed by the arachnoid mater. There are these kind of like little, I don't even know, they remind me of little hands, like that stretch from the arachnoid mater into the dural venous sinuses, and that allows the cerebrospinal fluid to go into these dural venous sinuses through these arachnoid villi, and there's going to be little pores in this arachnoid villi that will help that fluid to move into the dural venous sinuses at a specific rate. And that rate is really important because if too much cerebrospinal fluid is removed, there's not going to be enough cerebrospinal fluid around the brain because the choroid plexuses of the ventricles are not able to keep up with the production of the cerebrospinal fluid. And if arachnoid villi are pumping the CSF into the dural venous sinuses too slowly, then there's going to be too much of the CSF buildup around the brain, and that's going to put pressure on the brain, and that pressure is harmful to the brain tissue because it could kill it by constricting the blood vessels that supply the brain with oxygen and nutrients. So arachnoid villi actually control the rate of the CSF secretion into the dural venous sinuses. And here's a real view of the arachnoid villi. This is the surface of the cerebrum with its gyri and sulci. This is the longitudinal fissure between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. And the left hemisphere of the cerebrum is not covered by the meninges. It's completely exposed to show the surface of the brain. And the hemisphere on the right side is covered with the meninges. We can see the arachnoid mater. It looks kind of whitish, but a little bit more like a transparent. Actually, this is possibly the dura mater. But what I want you to see is these little dots here, and that's the arachnoid villi. So this is actually the dura mater. This is the arachnoid villi, and exposed by peeling some of the dura mater off because the arachnoid villi project into the space between the arachnoid and dura. Okay, so sometimes there is a buildup of cerebrospinal fluid inside, and that's called hydrocephalus. And this is a picture showing ventricles filled with cerebrospinal fluid in a healthy person, and this is the hydrocephalus when the ventricles get too full of the cerebrospinal fluid, and that is usually because of the that could happen because of the infections that affect the cerebrospinal fluid. The infections that affect the cerebrospinal fluid, whether it is a virus or bacteria, the infection, the invader that lives inside of the cerebrospinal fluid. The condition is called meningitis, and because of the word meninges, because it's the infection of the meninges, because cerebrospinal fluid is within the meninges. And that could cause the swelling and the buildup of the cerebrospinal fluid inside, causing hydrocephalus. You can see that if the ventricles expand too much, that's actually going to compress the brain tissue. You can see this brain tissue is looking healthy and normal, and here you can see the convolutions of the brain are constricted, compressed with a hydrocephalus. Okay, and the last thing we're going to talk about as far as the cerebrospinal fluid goes is the choroid plexuses.